The courtroom in Greenville, a quaint town nestled in the Tennessee foothills, buzzed softly with murmured conversations as Judge Evelyn Hart adjusted her robe. After 25 years on the bench, she had presided over countless cases, yet today felt different. The air was heavy, charged with an indescribable tension that prickled at her instincts. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice commanding yet measured. Evelyn rose from her seat, prepared to project the impartiality her role demanded. Her gaze shifted to the defendant being escorted into the room by two deputies. The moment her eyes locked onto the man, the pen in her hand slipped, clattering against the bench. It was him. Her breath caught in her throat before she managed to mask the reaction, her practiced composure shielding the storm brewing within her. The man in shackles, with his head slightly bowed, was none other than John Wilder. The boy who had once shared her lunchbox in second grade, climbed trees with her during summer afternoons, and stolen her first kiss under the middle school football bleachers. That was decades ago. John Wilder wasn't the carefree, golden-haired boy she once knew. The man before her looked hardened, his face lined with time and struggles. Yet, his eyes remained the same, gray-blue and piercing, now carrying a hollow sadness that made her chest tighten. "Your Honor," the prosecutor's voice jolted her back to the present. She gripped her gavel tightly, forcing herself to focus. "Proceed," she commanded, her voice steady. The charges were read aloud. Aggravated assault, breaking and entering, and a slew of other crimes that felt alien to the John she remembered. Her stomach churned, but her expression betrayed nothing. She could not afford a single flicker of emotion, not in this courtroom, not now. When John finally looked up, his eyes scanned the room and stopped on hers. Recognition flashed in his gaze, his lips parting slightly as if he might speak, but he held back. Evelyn fought to steady her breathing. She was a judge, a symbol of impartiality, and she couldn't allow her personal history to interfere. As the prosecutor outlined the grim details of the case, Evelyn's mind betrayed her, conjuring vivid memories of John. She saw him rescuing her from a stray dog, skipping stones with her by the lake, and making her laugh so hard her ribs hurt. Now, the same John stood accused of unthinkable crimes. The courtroom felt suffocating. The gavel struck the bench. "Court is in recess," she announced abruptly, her voice faltering slightly as she rose and retreated to her chambers. Behind the closed door of her chambers, Evelyn leaned against it, her heart pounding. Her mind whirled with questions she couldn't silence. How had John ended up here? Why were their paths crossing again after so many years, and under such circumstances? She rubbed her temples, trying to regain control, but her thoughts pulled her back to the past. In the Greenville of the 1970s, life had been simpler. Evelyn had been a studious girl with dreams of becoming a lawyer, while John was the neighborhood daredevil, fearless and magnetic. Despite their differences, their bond had been unbreakable. She could still hear his boyish laughter echoing down the tree-lined streets, see his sunburned face grinning as they raced bikes to the swimming hole, and feel the warmth of his hand in hers as he swore to protect her. John had been her rock during a turbulent childhood marked by her father's long absences and her mother's quiet struggles. But life had a way of pulling even the closest friends apart. By high school, Evelyn had immersed herself in academics while John grew restless, falling in with a rougher crowd. She remembered their final conversation like it was yesterday. He told her he was leaving town, his voice brimming with both defiance and sorrow. "They'll chew me up if I stay here," he'd said, kicking the dirt with his boots. "Then fight back," she had pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to do this." John had only shaken his head, his jaw set in that stubborn way she knew so well. "I've got to find my own way, Evie." That was the last time she had seen him, until now. Evelyn sank into her chair, the weight of her memories pressing down on her. Over the years, she'd heard whispers about John. Trouble with the law, struggles with addiction, failed relationships. She had buried those fragments of his story under the demands of her career. But now, there was no escaping them. John Wilder was here, in her courtroom, and the boy she once adored was now a man on trial. John Wilder was accused of a crime that could obliterate whatever fragile existence he had managed to cobble together. The irony was unbearable. The boy who had once stood as her defender now faced allegations of being a violent predator. Evelyn felt the weight of it pressing down on her, gnawing at her resolve in ways she couldn't ignore. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Judge Hart, the recess is almost over," her assistant reminded her gently. Evelyn straightened, the mask of professionalism sliding back into place. "I'll be right there," she replied, her voice measured, though her mind was anything but calm. Returning to the courtroom, Evelyn's eyes caught John S. again. His gaze held something she couldn't quite name, remorse, perhaps, or a silent plea for understanding. It sent a pang through her chest, but she forced herself to break eye contact and focus on the task at hand. The prosecutor resumed, methodically laying out the evidence: surveillance footage, witness statements, and physical traces left at the scene.
It was damning.
The details painted a grim narrative, one that seemed nearly impossible to refute. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was murkier than it appeared, hidden beneath layers of assumptions and unanswered questions. As the session continued, her mind churned. What had driven John to this moment? And what was she, of all people, supposed to do about it? She gripped the edge of her bench as the prosecutor outlined the sequence of events. John was accused of breaking into a hardware store after hours, assaulting the owner, and attempting to flee with several high-value items. The crime had left the store owner, Frank Daniels, hospitalized with severe injuries. Surveillance footage showed John exiting the scene, his clothes stained with what appeared to be blood. The courtroom was eerily quiet except for the prosecutor's unrelenting voice. The defendant, Mr. Wilder, has a history of minor offenses, petty theft, public disturbances, but this is his most violent act to date. Evelyn's gaze flicked to John at the defense table. He sat slumped, his expression blank, but she knew that wasn't the John she had grown up with. That John had been full of life, fiercely loyal, and quick to act for those he cared about. The man before her looked hollowed out, worn by years of struggles she couldn't begin to imagine. Alan Griggs, the wiry defense attorney, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, while the charges are indeed serious, I urge the court to consider the full context. My client admits he was present at the scene but denies being the perpetrator. There are critical discrepancies in the prosecution's account that demand scrutiny." Evelyn's gaze darted between the prosecutor and the defense attorney, her resolve tested by every word. She prided herself on her impartiality, her ability to focus solely on the facts. But this case was different. Her past with John loomed large, tugging at her thoughts and muddying her judgment. Then came the surveillance footage. The grainy black and white video played on the courtroom screen, showing John leaving the store in a frantic state. His clothes bore dark stains, and his expression was one of panic. Evelyn's stomach churned. The images didn't bode well for him. Witness statements followed. A neighbor claimed to have seen a man resembling John loitering near the store earlier that evening. Another reported overhearing an argument between two men shortly before the break-in. Mr. Wilder was found less than a mile from the scene, the prosecutor continued, driving the narrative home. Evelyn kept her expression neutral, but inside, her thoughts raced. Each new piece of evidence seemed to drive the nail further into John's case, yet her gut told her there was more beneath the surface. She couldn't stop wondering, what had happened that night? And was John truly the monster this evidence painted him to be? The weight of the case pressed down on her as Evelyn tried to regain focus. She couldn't deny the strong emotional pull of her memories with John. The line between impartiality and personal involvement was becoming increasingly blurred. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder, could John truly have changed so much? Or was there still a part of him, that same boy she had known, buried beneath the mistakes and struggles of the years? She reached for the file in front of her, flipping through the witness statements, the photos, the reports. The evidence was clear, but something about it didn't sit right. John's history didn't fit the narrative the prosecution was painting. Evelyn was left with a growing suspicion that this was a story of more than just guilt or innocence. She knew John's past, and the familiar ache in her chest suggested that he wasn't a cold-blooded criminal. But could she really trust her instincts when the stakes were so high? The next morning, as the sun filtered through the blinds of her chambers, Evelyn prepared for another long day in court. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Justice is blind, Evie. But fairness, that takes heart. It was a reminder she had carried with her for years, but it felt heavier now. Could she balance justice with the fairness of her heart, especially when that heart ached for a boy she once knew? She entered the courtroom, her robe trailing behind her like a shroud of authority. The gavel rang out, the room falling into a tense silence. The defense team was ready to present, and Evelyn knew this was the moment that would determine everything. Alan Griggs was standing, and as he called John to the stand, there was a collective shift in the air. John hadn't spoken yet, and now, the truth was about to come from his own lips. As he made his way to the stand, the once confident boy now seemed fragile, his hands trembling slightly, his jaw set as though preparing for the worst. Evelyn saw him clearly now, no longer the young boy with the mischievous smile, but a man broken by life, burdened by the choices he'd made. She watched as John took the oath, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. Alan Griggs wasted no time, immediately asking John to recount his actions the night of the alleged crime. John cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper, as he began. "I was walking past the hardware store when I heard yelling," John explained. "At first, I thought it was just an argument. But then I heard something break. I went to check it out, and that's when I saw him. He was attacking Mr. Daniels. I tried to stop him, but the guy turned on me. We fought, and then he ran off. I stayed to help Daniels, but when I saw the police lights, I panicked. I ran. I shouldn't have, but I didn't think anyone would believe me." The room murmured in disbelief, but Evelyn silenced them with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Order," she commanded, her voice firm despite the storm inside her. Alan continued, pressing John further. "You mentioned a man attacking Mr. Daniels. Did you recognize him?" John shook his head.
"No."
"He was wearing a hoodie, and it was dark. I couldn't see his face. Why didn't you stay and explain this to the authorities?" Alan asked, his voice calm but pressing. John hesitated. His gaze dropped to his hands. "Because of my record. People like me, we don't get second chances." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. Evelyn's heart clenched. She understood the truth behind them. The town of Greenville had no mercy for people with a past, and John's history made him an easy target. The years of mistakes, of bad choices, had shaped him into someone who was seen as irredeemable. But was that really who he was? Or was there more to the story? As the questioning continued, Evelyn found herself watching John intently. His voice, his mannerisms, they seemed genuine, but she couldn't shake the nagging doubt. Was she seeing the truth, or was her memory of the boy he used to be clouding her judgment? As the day wore on, the questions only grew more complicated. John's testimony had created more cracks in the prosecution's case, but it hadn't cleared him entirely. By the time court adjourned for the day, Evelyn felt no closer to a resolution. The decision weighed on her like a stone in her chest. She couldn't let emotions dictate her choices, but how could she ignore the connection she had once shared with John? The boy who had promised to always protect her was now standing accused of something unspeakable. That night, as Evelyn sifted through the case files in her chambers, her mind wandered back to another time, a summer evening when she and John had sat by the lake. They had talked about their futures. He had grinned and tossed a pebble into the water, saying, "You'll make a great lawyer someday. You'll fight for people who need it." And she had asked, "What about you?" He had shrugged, a playful glint in his eye. "I'll probably just get into trouble." Evelyn shook her head, forcing herself to return to the present. The case wasn't about the past. It was about the truth. And she had to find it, no matter how much it hurt. Evelyn sat in the courtroom, her mind weighed down with anxiety. Today was the final day of the trial, and everything was coming to an end. The moment had arrived where the verdict would be delivered, but she worried about the consequences of her decision, not just for John but for herself. John had proven he should be exonerated of the crimes he was accused of, but was he truly innocent? Or had he just been lucky? The courtroom was quieter than usual, and the tension was palpable. Evelyn sat up straighter in her chair, eyes fixed on John as his defense attorney prepared to rest the case. The prosecutor seemed poised to deliver a counterargument, but before Alan Griggs could finish, John leaned over and whispered something to him. Alan hesitated for a moment, his face tense, then stood. "Your Honor, my client wishes to make a personal statement to the court," Alan said. His words cut through the stillness of the room. Defendants rarely made personal statements, and it was a risky move. Emotions could sway a jury, but they could also be damning. Evelyn hesitated, then gave a small nod, signaling her approval. John rose and walked to the center of the room. The sound of his chains echoed softly through the quiet space, and the room seemed to hold its breath. He stood tall but appeared vulnerable, his hands trembling as he grasped the podium. "When I was a kid," John began, his voice rough but steady, "I had dreams, just like anyone else. I wanted to be someone, do something that mattered." His voice was strong, yet tinged with the weight of years of regret. Evelyn felt a tightness in her chest. She had once known this boy with big dreams, the same boy who had shared her hopes. She forced herself to remain composed, but it was a struggle. But life doesn't always go the way you plan. John paused for a moment, then continued, "I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes, plenty of them. But that night, when I walked into that store, I wasn't looking to hurt anyone. I was trying to stop something worse from happening." He looked around the room, making eye contact with the jury, the attorneys, and finally, Evelyn. "I panicked because I knew no one would believe me. Maybe that's my fault. My past doesn't make me look like the good guy, but I'm not the monster they're trying to make me out to be." John's voice faltered for the first time. "I've lost a lot in my life. My parents, my friends, and most of all, my sense of who I am." He swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the jury. "But standing here now, I'm asking you to see me for more than my mistakes. I didn't hurt Mr. Daniels. I was trying to help." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the armrests of her chair. The room shifted. The jurors exchanged glances. The prosecutors scribbled notes. John's words had struck a chord, but they had also opened him to scrutiny. "Your Honor," John said softly, his gaze turning to her directly, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, it felt as though they were the only two people in a room. "You know me. At least you used to. I'm not asking for favors or leniency. I'm just asking for the truth to matter." Evelyn's chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. His plea lingered in the air as he returned to his seat. Alan Griggs placed a hand briefly on John's shoulder before turning back to the judge. "The defense rests, Your Honor." The prosecutor wasted no time rebutting, attacking John's credibility, highlighting the gaps in his testimony. Evelyn listened intently, her face a mask of composure, but inside, turmoil churned. She couldn't let emotions guide her, not with the stakes this high. As the session ended and the jury was dismissed, Evelyn remained seated, her gavel resting idle in her hand. John's words echoed in her mind, "You know me. At least you used to." She stared at the empty defendant's seat, a lump forming in her throat. Did she truly know him anymore? And if she did, could she trust her instincts, or were they clouded by memories of who he once was? The final day of the trial arrived, cloaked in anticipation, so thick it felt suffocating. Evelyn took her seat, her face a mask of calm, though her thoughts churned beneath the surface. The jury filed in, their expressions grave, and Evelyn's pulse quickened. This was the moment where justice and truth would either align or collide. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady. The middle-aged woman in the front row, the jury foreperson, stood, holding a folded piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." She handed it to the bailiff. The seconds seemed to stretch as the bailiff brought the verdict to Evelyn. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the crisp black ink. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly replaced by the weight of what she would have to say next. She looked out over the courtroom, briefly meeting John's eyes. His face was unreadable, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. Evelyn took a steadying breath and addressed the jury. In the case of the state of Tennessee versus John Wilder, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. The room erupted, gasps, whispers, and the faint sound of someone crying in relief. John's shoulders sagged as though the weight of the world had been lifted, but Evelyn saw it in his eyes. The fight wasn't over for John. This was just one battle in the larger war to rebuild his life. "Order," she called, striking her gavel, and the noise subsided. "The defendant is free to go. Court is adjourned." John turned to Alan Griggs, who gave him a firm handshake, but his eyes quickly sought Evelyn's. She remained on the bench, her heart pounding as he approached. "Thank you," John said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Evelyn hesitated. "I didn't make the decision, John. The jury did." He nodded, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his lips. "Still, thank you." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history between them. Evelyn wanted to ask so many things: where he would go now, what he would do, whether he would finally find peace, but the words caught in her throat. "I hope this is a turning point for you," she said at last, her voice soft but firm. "Don't waste it." John's expression turned serious. "I won't." As he walked out of the courtroom, Evelyn watched him go. A mixture of relief and sorrow settled over her. She had done her job, maintained her impartiality, upheld the law, but the personal cost had been greater than she had anticipated. The case had forced her to confront her own biases, her own humanity. Later that evening, as Evelyn sat in her quiet chambers, she reflected on the trial. John's story wasn't unique, not in a system that often judged people more for their past than their potential. But today had been a victory, not just for him, but for the idea that redemption was possible, that people could change if given the chance. She picked up the photo of her father from her desk. His words echoed in her mind. "Justice is blind, but fairness takes heart." Evelyn smiled faintly. She couldn't change John's past, but maybe, just maybe, this verdict had given him the chance to write a better future.